Good morning and welcome to Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta's monthly webcast. I'm Surisha Gunta, an attorney with the partnership, and today we have Robin Sangston from Cox Communications joining us to speak to us about how to prepare for and run an effective board meeting. Before she jumps into the substance of today's topic, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. Our mission is to connect attorneys who are interested in providing pro bono services with nonprofits who are in need of free business legal services. Our clients are 501c3 organizations in the metro Atlanta area that serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals and are otherwise unable to afford legal services. If you're interested in learning more about our organization or in applying to become a client, please visit our website. Also on our website, you'll find a host of information, including previous webcasts, articles, dates for future workshops and events, and the slides and today's webcast will also be on our website in a few days. Just a little bit of a disclaimer now. Today's information is just general advice. It's not specific legal counsel for your organization. So if you have any specific questions, please follow up with your PBPA attorney. And today's webcast is also copyright Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. Now, Robin, I'll hand the mic over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Surisha, and thank you so much to Pro Bono Partnership for having me here today. It's my pleasure. I come to this topic from having served on a number of nonprofit boards over my years, and I love this topic because I can assure you that my most enjoyable and memorable experiences have been when I've been involved with a board where it's clear that the board leadership has thought long and hard about what kind of board meetings they want to have, and so that they can foster discussion and have a much more engaged board experience. And that makes the entire experience much more rewarding for your board members, and you're going to have a lot better results coming out of your board meeting. So it's great that you all are paying attention to this and thinking about it. Before we jump into the nuts and bolts, I was just going to talk a little bit about sort of the different philosophies around how to use board meetings. I've been involved in some larger boards for larger organizations where the board meeting is really more of a one-way download of information. Most of the sausage gets made by the executive committee before the board meeting, and so you come and attend as a board member and you're really receiving information, updating you on what's been going on with the organization, motivating you possibly as a donor or a sponsor or a large supporter to go out into the community and advocate for the organization, but not really trying to engage you in a lot of the decision making and discussion. The other type of board experience, and that's what I really want to address today, is more of the two-way dialogue experience where your board members come prepared because you have helped to prepare them, and then they come in with questions, thoughts and ideas, and you have an open dialogue and discussion, and hopefully after the board meeting you come out with a lot of really good action items and new ideas on how to make your organization better and stronger. So we're going to talk about how to make sure you're having that kind of a two-way dialogue board meeting, which does require more preparation. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today may be addressed to some degree in your bylaws, so you always want to start by taking a look at your bylaws and seeing what they're going to say about what constitutes your executive committee, what sort of a quorum you need for voting, what committees you may be required to have or allowed to have by your bylaws. So do be sure to consult your bylaws at the very beginning or the onset of thinking about your board meetings. But a lot of this may not be addressed in your bylaws, so you'll have a lot more latitude to pick and choose from the ideas that you're going to hear today. So one of the first things that you're going to want to think about is how many board meetings you want to have each year. And there often are some that are sort of the mandatory board meetings. You may need to have a board meeting that will be where the topic will be receiving the audit report from your outside auditor. Very important to have that for board governance and transparency, to have that auditor and the chair of your audit committee, if you have one, in the room and reviewing the results of the audit committee report with the board so the board can ask questions, and hopefully you're going to come away with a clean report from your auditor. So that may be one of those mandatory meetings you need to have. You may also have a requirement to have some sort of an annual meeting where the board and other stakeholders are invited to come and attend and hear what the organization has been up to. That, again, that may be more of a sort of a one-way download sort of a meeting, but you may need to bake in time for that. And then another type of board meeting that I highly recommend that can be very effective is an annual strategic planning session that really is designed to focus entirely on looking at your strategic plan, assessing it, and making sure you're making adjustments to make sure that it continues to be relevant and that the board and the organization are staying on track. So those are some special types of gatherings where you would need to have your board. But other than that, you may have board meetings monthly, you may have them quarterly. They may be organized around the calendar based on what type of organization you are. For example, if you're an organization involved with school children or young children, you may have board meetings during the typical school year and you may be off for the summer. If you're a board where you have external board members coming in from out of town or out of state, you may not do monthly meetings. You may do 3 or 4 longer meetings, 3-hour meetings where you have people actually come in for the meeting. So you have to give some thought to the number of meetings, the time you're going to allot, and sort of the cadence of your meetings so that your board members know at the beginning of the year what the expectations are for their participation. And then you also want to think about, are your meetings going to be all in person? If you're able to do so, I highly recommend that. It's so much more effective when you can have board members in the room, building relationships with each other, meeting the staff, getting to know the CEO or executive director. It's much more effective, and you're going to be much better off in building trusted relationships that will help move the work of the organization forward if you can do in-person meetings. But I know I've been on boards where we do have people that just can't make it, wherever it may be. They're coming in from out of town, or everyone's busy and they may not be able to get to a meeting. So you may decide that some meetings are allowed to be telephonic. I can tell you that if they are going to be telephonic, you really need to work on having the best telecommunications equipment that you can possibly afford to have. It can be terribly frustrating if someone's trying to dial into a meeting, or they're just calling in on a cell phone and not even a landline, and there's poor acoustics, there's people rattling papers, and then there's also the problem if there's presentations or things that are being shown on AV or handouts, then they may not even be able to see or have access to those. So again, think about using sparingly the participation of board members by telephonic means and not actually in person in the room. I do want to really touch on something that I have learned over the years, again, that building relationships is so incredibly important among your board members. Again, I've joined boards where I've come into my first board meeting, there have been no introductions, there are no name plates, there's no table cards. I sit down, I have a board book, and we're off to the races, and I really have very little idea of who's even in the room, who's a board member versus who's a staff member who may be an external advisor. So think about trying to have some way, perhaps before your annual cadence of meetings starts, that you have a social gathering among your board members and your key staff members, whether it's cocktails the night before the first board meeting, or a luncheon built into the time frame. Or some other way for board members to get to know one another, because again, the quicker they get to know who everybody is and what their roles are and what their talents are, and this is the person who has expertise in finance, or this is the person who has marketing expertise. It's really nice to know that what your other board members have skills in, and who their companies may be that they're affiliated with and the like, so that again, you can move more quickly to the work of the organization. Okay, so talking about how you're going to prepare for your first meeting or the next meeting that you're going to have. So preparation is really key. You don't want to have any surprises in the board meeting. So the board members should come pretty much having a good idea about what's to be accomplished during their time there that day. So that requires that you start several weeks in advance by first developing your agenda for the meeting. And you want to make sure that agenda is thought through, that you're allocating sufficient amounts of time for each topic that you want to cover, and that you've gone and solicited input from all of the relevant parties who might want to have a portion of that time on that agenda. So you'll go to staff. There may be certain staff who typically make reports at those meetings. There may be a director of programming or a director of fundraising. That's one of the boards I'm on right now has a person who's in charge of managing our programs for our residents it's a homeless organization, and so we have a staff member who is in charge of programming. She always gives a very robust report. So you have to solicit input from staff. You also need to solicit input from the various committees. So if your board has board committees, you want to make sure that they may have business that they want to bring up, either old business that they want to report on, or they may want to talk about some new business that they're thinking about needing to do going forward. So you want to solicit from the committees. Obviously, executive director, CEO is going to require a good chunk of time. And then you'll start preparing your agenda based on the different topics that you need to cover, and then thinking about how much time you're going to need to allocate for each one of those topics. Get that agenda out in advance so that, again, the board understands what the expectations are, what's going to be discussed, so they can be thinking about that. And then if people forget to bring their copy, make sure you have copies in the room. That's always a great idea. A lot of boards are moving toward having all of their board materials available online to get rid of the paper problem. But I know smaller organizations may not be able to afford those sorts of electronic services, and so they may still be in a paper environment. So if that's the case, you're going to want to try to make sure that you have that paper available at the meeting. We're also going to be meeting to make sure that the minutes from any previous meeting have been prepared and that they've been distributed to the board members before the meeting, so that the board isn't wasting time sitting in a meeting reading over the minutes from the last meeting, that they can review those minutes at their leisure before they come into the boardroom. That enables those members who may not have been able to participate in that board meeting to get up to speed in what was addressed and what might be carrying forward. And then also, as a matter of good board governance, you're going to need to present those minutes at the meeting, and either the secretary or another person at the meeting will ask for the minutes to be approved. Any corrections or additions or deletions can be noted at that time, and then the board should vote on approving those minutes. And then there's other materials that you may want to disseminate to your board members in advance of the meeting. Again, staff reports, financials, very important to prepare the financials in advance and have those available to board members to review. Depending on the financial sophistication of your board members, they may not necessarily be able to fully comprehend the financials on their own, so you're going to definitely want to spend some time in the board meeting reviewing those and answering any questions that the board may have, but you definitely want to make those financials available. Again, a good board governance is having those prepared and available in advance of the board meeting. Also, if there are any sort of thought pieces or white papers, if there's research, if you're the type of organization that's involved in social policy or public policy and there's work being done in that area, you may want to provide those sorts of research or reference materials in advance, again, so board members have the time at their leisure to read these materials before they come into the board meeting, so they're ready to go and you're not kind of fumbling around and having people trying to catch up in the meeting. And then, as I mentioned, any committee reports should be disseminated in advance.
Yeah, the question.
Oh, great.
Do you have a recommendation in terms of how far in advance the agenda should be distributed?
It's a really good question, because honestly, I can tell you a lot of organizations get caught up and the agenda is going out the day before, and that's really not acceptable. I recommend that you try to get it out a week before. I know that can be hard. People are scrambling, and depending on how much staff the organization has, it can be a challenge, but try to give folks a good business week in advance for them to review those the agenda.
Thank you.
Good question. Okay, so how do you get the meeting started and how do you move through the meeting to make sure it's as effective as possible? The board chair is going to want to open the meeting with a welcome to everyone in attendance and any necessary introductions. And you want to make sure that that board meeting is starting on time. So if people are going to be dialing in advance, you're going to want to have somebody making sure that you're checking on the AV 15 minutes before the start of the board meeting. You don't want people dialing in right at the top of the hour or whenever the meeting's supposed to start. Again, I think I briefly mentioned this, but in case you have new people in the room, it's a great idea to do name tags or to do table cards in front of each seating area that has the name of the person, so that everyone knows who's in the room and can figure out, okay, who is staff and who is board and who is maybe an external advisor who's been invited in to present on a topic. You'll want to figure out very quickly at the top of the meeting whether you have a quorum. So if you're going to be needing to take any votes, your bylaws will probably indicate what number of board members need to be present out of your total number of board members in order to have a quorum, so that you can take any necessary votes that you need to take in that meeting. If you don't have a quorum, I would check your bylaws and if there's any other unique state law requirements. But I have been in meetings where there is actually no quorum, but we're still able to proceed through most of the agenda. We just can't take votes on things that would require a quorum. So I've also been in meetings where the quorum has showed up partway through the meeting when someone's dialed in late. But you'll need to have maybe your secretary or a staff member keeping track of the quorum for you and letting you know, oh yes, we now have a quorum, so we can approve the minutes, or if there's something that we need to vote on, you can do that. And then, so you would move the first order of business after introductions and ascertaining that you have a quorum would be moving to approve the minutes. And then you allow for anyone in attendance to make any additions or corrections or clarifications. And then once those are duly noted, you would have a vote calling for all in favor to approve the minutes and any opposed. And then if it passes, then those minutes are approved and they'll be part of your good board governance records. Typically after that, you would move into reports on areas of old business. So this could be committee work that's been going on between meetings, or some other aspect of your organization's business that you want to give an update on to the board. And make sure that you've thought about how much time you need for one of these, each one of these committee reports, and you're allocating sufficient time for the report and for any questions as well. And then you would move into the new business section of your board meeting. This should take up the significant, if you really want to have one of these board meetings I'm talking about, you have good dialogue and discussion, the new business may take up a significant chunk of your time that you've allocated. If you want to discuss some aspect where you're really working hard to improve progress, whether it's fundraising, whether it's programming, whether it's marketing, whatever it might be, but this is where you really want to try to tap into that expertise that your board members bring to the organization and let them all have an opportunity to chime in and speak about any new area. The financials need to be covered at some point in that meeting, and again, there may be a way that you typically like to do that, whether it's earlier or later, but you want to make sure that you have the treasurer present the financials, and then whoever, whether it's staff or a board member, will want to walk through the operating results in the manner that your organization tracks that, whether it's against budget or in some other way. And then if it is time to do your audit committee review, you want to make sure that you have plenty of time for your external auditor to be there in the room to present the audit report and to answer any questions that the board member has. And then you want to make sure that you are keeping on track, that you have managed all of your time effectively so that you can close out the meeting on time. I'm going to talk a little bit about executive session. That is something that you may not need to have in each meeting, but you should think about whether you want to use executive session. They are coming, I will say, more into vogue, if that's the right word. It's very common now to see an executive session as something added that's going to be addressed at some point during the board meeting, typically at the end of the meeting, but there's no reason why you couldn't do an executive session earlier. So for example, if you're having an executive session because there's a crisis with the organization, you're not going to wait till the end of the board meeting to take up executive session. And what I mean by executive session is this is a time for the board to get together to work on something that may be particularly sensitive or requires confidentiality or is a burning crisis type issue without having others present for that part of the discussion. So you can have executive session just with your CEO or executive director in the room. You can have executive session without any staff at all, just board. You could have executive session where you have an external advisor that you brought in, for example, outside counsel, if you have a legal matter that you need to address and you don't want to address that because of confidentiality reasons in the regular board meeting with staff or others present. So some types of uses for executive session with the executive director, CEO, present would be if there is some other issue involving staff. Perhaps there's a performance issue, or you're having challenges. You might want to just have your executive director in a meeting of executive session with the board to discuss whatever challenges they're having around staff. If there, again, as I said, if there's some kind of a legal issue involving the organization and you want to have counsel present, or not counsel present, but just have the executive director there and not other members of staff hearing about this confidential legal issue, that's a good use for executive session. When you might want to have an executive session without your executive director present would be certainly if you're talking about performance of the executive director, their performance appraisal. It could just be typical great news, they're doing fabulously and there's nothing wrong, but you don't want to do that outside of the hearing of the executive director. It could be that there are some performance challenges with the executive director. It's not uncommon that you might have a new executive director who is completely new in this role and has never been an executive director before, and they're performing well, but they might need some coaching in an area. So the board might want to discuss whether they want to allocate funds to get a coach for the executive director to work on whatever it is they may be working on. Other topics where you might want to have an executive session, I can speak from personal experience recently. We're looking at making an acquisition of some property, and it's a big decision, and it's going to cause require a lot of additional financial support, and it's the kind of discussion that might be unsettling for some members of staff because it's a big change. So you might want to have a discussion like that outside of the hearing of staff and just with the executive director. So again, you don't always need an executive session, but you should be thinking about whether that would be appropriate, and if so, you'll want to put time for that on your agenda and have that within the allotted time period.
We have a question about financials. How often should audit reports happen?
Well, it's possible that your bylaws would address this, but in my experience, it's annually. You have an annual audit. You hire an external auditor to come in, and they will spend usually several months. It could be as long as 6 months doing a full deep dive review of the organization's financials, interviewing staff, looking at financial reports, and then doing their assessment. And then they come and then they'll present their opinion. Hopefully that you'll get a clean opinion that everything is fine. But I would say at a minimum you need that annually. The next couple of slides are I'm just pointing this out to you, and I'm not certainly an expert in this area, but under Georgia law, they do have Georgia's sunshine laws for some nonprofit organizations that receive a significant amount of funding from the state. I would direct you to my friends at Pro Bono Partnership if you need help getting a lawyer to help you walk through that. But just be mindful that if you are a nonprofit in Georgia that is getting a significant amount of your financial support from the state, you may have a different additional obligations around having your meetings open to the public and then preserving records so that the records can be subject to an open record request. So you want to make sure that you're complying with that.
And we do have a webcast on that topic as well.
Perfect. I just handed that one right to you. So the next slide is talking again a little bit more detail about the board meeting documents. I think it's very helpful if you can prepare a board book for your board members and get that out with the agenda ahead of the meeting. And that would include, I have a list of things here on the slide, but in addition to the agenda, you would have the minutes that are up for review and approval at the board meeting. You would have a copy of the financials for the period prior that you'll be discussing in the meeting. You might have a copy of the budget included as well, that the board would have approved the annual budget. Keep that in the board book. Again, if it is a meeting where you're going to be having an audit report, you'd want a copy of the audit report in your board book. Staff reports on various areas that staff is working, whether it's fundraising, whether it's marketing, whether it's programs. They may have reports that you would want to include in that board book. Committee reports, so if you have committees of the board, they may have a report that they want to present. One common committee that organizations have is a nominating and governance committee, and that committee is often used to help with board succession planning. And so they may be tasked with trying to recruit new board members to your board. And so your nominating and governance committee might have some resumes of prospects that you would want to include in the board materials so that you could discuss those candidates for board service during your meeting. So that type of document would be included in the board book. Again, white papers, any research that your organization is commissioning that's pertinent to the mission of your organization. If you have recent media or press clippings about your organization, positive hopefully, about events that you've been hosting or work you've been doing in the community, or perhaps featuring members of your staff or members of your organization or your constituents or whom you're serving, you definitely want to include that sort of press in there. I know hopefully you have a website that has a lot of that material on it too, but not every board member is probably on your website as often as they should be. So if you really want to highlight some of the great successes of your organization, it's great to include copies of media and press clippings. And then I like to include a copy of the board of director contact information. So following the meeting, if a board member wants to reach out to another board member, they have that handy and they know how to contact that person. So roles and responsibilities of your board members, and this slide primarily is addressing what I would call your executive committee. Again, look to your bylaws. They may talk about what constitutes your executive committee. Typically, it's a chair or president or a vice chair or vice president, and then there's a board secretary and a treasurer. And then you will have information in your bylaws about what the term and tenure of each one of those positions should be, and how succession planning works is in an organization where typically the vice chair or vice president serves and then succeeds the president or the chair after a period of time. So make sure you understand how board members move through those executive committee roles so that you're thinking ahead a couple of steps to make sure that you have good bench strength for people moving up in the organization, so you don't find yourself in a position where suddenly you are uncertain about whether you're going to have the right person that you want in that chair position down the road. You're also going to be thoughtful about your committees, what committees you want to have. Again, the bylaws may address that, but you're not necessarily precluded to only have the committees in the bylaws. You can always create ad hoc committees. So if there's a pressing issue, so for example, if you don't have a nominating and governance committee structure already set up forth by your bylaws, but you're concerned that the number of board members, maybe you're having a hard time getting a full slate, or maybe a lot of people are rolling off, and you're feeling pressure to find good candidates to fill those board seats, you may want to stand up an ad hoc nominations committee where you recruit some board members who are willing to serve on that ad hoc committee and to go out and do some search and find some good candidates for you that you want to bring back to the board for consideration. So there's really no limit. I've been on boards where we'll stand up an ad hoc marketing committee because we'll find that we don't really have enough internal expertise to market our organization or our events, and so we might go and see if there's a volunteer expert out there, a marketing expert who would work with the committee of the board to help with the organization's marketing. Again, you can be creative about that, and these can be standing committees or they can be ad hoc committees, and you'll want to make sure that you have a chair of each one of those committees for good governance, and so that the chair then can report out at board meetings and prepare any committee reports that you'll need for your board books. And then you'll have staff participating in your board meetings. I really like having staff there. I've seen some organizations where it's really just the executive director or the CEO and not a lot of staff present. But I find it very effective to have at least the key staff players in the key roles, whoever maybe is your controller, CFO type person, or who is your chief administration officer, or who might be your chief of programming, whatever the key roles that you have staff positions in. It's great for the board to get to meet these people, develop relationships with them, have confidence in the work they're doing. And I also think it's rewarding for staff to have interaction with the board members. Again, it's all part of building that trusted working relationship. So you can really get to the business of the organization because everybody knows everybody and everybody has a good rapport already. has good trust in the people there. I have another note on relationships again. You want to make sure you start your meeting on time and you finish it on time, because people are busy, but you want to build in time either before or after, or if it's a longer meeting, in the middle for a lunch, so you have some time for board members just to chat with each other, and it isn't all just people rolling in and people rolling out after the meeting and without any opportunity to really get to socialize. But you don't want the meeting time sort of being interrupted with socializing, so break out that time that's designated for social time as opposed to the time that's for doing board work. So follow-up. So what are you doing after you have that great, fantastic board meeting? You're going to come out of there and all these ideas are going to be whirling around in your head, and everybody's going to be rushing off. Staff is going to have assignments, and the committees are going to be having assignments. And then if you don't keep yourself organized and on track, everybody walks out. It's a great meeting, and then everybody forgets what happened a week later, right? And nothing gets done. So you definitely want to make sure that the minutes get prepared promptly following that meeting, so it isn't somebody trying to craft minutes, 4 months after the last board meeting or even a month after the last board meeting off of their recollection. The minutes really should be put together. They don't need to be circulated yet to the board, but whoever's responsibility is to prepare the minutes, they should pretty quickly move to codify those minutes and get those down in writing, so while memories are still fresh, right? Then you want to make sure that assignments are made for the follow-up action items that have been decided on at that board meeting. So whether it's staff has work that they've been directed to do by the board, or whether committees have work that they've been instructed to, you want to make sure as the leader of the organization that all those assignments have been made and people understand what they're accountable for, so that the ball doesn't get dropped. Typically between board meetings you'll have a meeting of your executive committee, and that's one of the best ways to keep everybody on track between board meetings. So if you don't have board meetings every month, and let's say you have board meetings every 3 or 4 months, you may want to have a monthly executive committee call with your executive committee where you remind everybody what was discussed and agreed upon in the last board meeting, and then you want to give progress reports and updates. And in those executive committee meetings, you can also bring up any other emergencies or issues of the day that have cropped up between board meeting. I think it's good, though, to have those regularly scheduled, again, so your executive committee can bake those into their calendar. Maybe have them, every Monday morning at 8 o'clock by phone for an hour. You may not use the whole hour, but at least it's on their calendar, and they know that it's time to commit to their executive committee work. The committees should be meeting between board meetings, and that's something that you really want to think about. If you're not really using committees right now, that's a great way to get the best strength out of your board members who have particular expertise. So rather than having them, let's say you have, again, somebody who's particularly good at social media, rather than having them give their ideas at a board meeting, maybe you put them as chair of a marketing committee and have them get some other folks involved. Perhaps some staff, other board members, perhaps you have volunteers who are not part of the actual board structure, probably some Gen Yers or, Gen Zers out there with strength in social media. You want to pull that committee together, and you want to have them doing that work in between board meetings so that they can make presentations and update everybody on the progress they've made. I have on this slide a list of some of the common committees. Again, your board bylaws may dictate certain committees that you must have as a requirement of the board, but finance committee is a typical one that you'll have. The audit committee is where you'll have the chair of the audit committee who will work with the external auditor and staff to make sure that that audit report is prepared and delivered periodically, I say annually at a minimum. Maybe a nominations and governance committee. They can address board recruiting and succession planning outside of the board meeting. They can also work on governance issues. So if you're an organization that's been in existence for a long time and you haven't really had a board bylaws refresh in a while, you might want to task your governance committee with taking a look at the bylaws and making sure that they're still current under the state of law that you all are organized under. I was on a board recently where I was chairing the Nominations and Governance Committee, and it's a nonprofit that was organized under New York law, and New York had just gone through a very extensive rewrite of its rules around nonprofits. Very, very extensive rewriting around having whistleblower avenues and that have to be delineated clearly on a website and communicated throughout the organization and the board, and also very stringent rules around conflict of interest and the board needing to complete conflict of interest disclosure forms when they join the board, and then annually thereafter ensuring that they aren't any conflicts in their relationship and their ability to give their fiduciary duty toward the organization. So again, you might want to, and this would be a great thing to have Pro Bono Partnership help you with, doing a refresh of those board governance documents, making sure they're both legally valid still, and also that they're really serving the needs of your organization and the mission of your organization, which can change over time. And so the bylaws might have been created at a time when your mission was different than it is right now, or you may have made changes. So that's really what you could use that committee for. A membership committee is great depending on what sort of membership your organization has, but if you're the type of nonprofit where you might have corporate membership or individuals who join as members, that's a good committee to have, because it's work that needs to be going on outside of the board meeting context, and so you want to be able to have a committee that's tasked with helping with strategies around growing your membership, retaining your membership, and the like. And then there you certainly want to have a staff member assigned to support that committee and work with the board members assigned to that committee. An advocacy committee is a great one if, again, you're the type of nonprofit where you may be doing some public policy work, or you may be advocating for change in the area that your mission supports, and that is one where you might want to recruit some external help to that committee, whether it's lawyers who are versed in that area of public policy, or others out in the community that you support. But those are the types of people that you'd want to have on your advocacy committee. That often is an ad hoc committee as well. If there's a particular Supreme Court case that's being heard in a term and they're taking up an issue that could have a great impact on your organization and your mission, you might want to stand up an advocacy committee and get some external experts to support the work of that committee that then can report back to the board, and decisions can be made on what involvement you might want to have in that particular issue. A programming committee is another committee that you might have as an annual committee, but depending on how much programming you do, it might be an ad hoc committee as well. So if you all do a major event annually where you invite members of the community to it, you might want to stand up a programming committee and have a mixture of staff and board members and external volunteers to help put on whatever programming it is that you want to put on. That is a very, very time-consuming committee usually, so you want to be thoughtful about how many people you have on that committee, making sure that there's no burnout, that you're refreshing the membership of that committee, because programming can take up a lot of time. And then I think I've mentioned marketing is another area where you might want to have a marketing or social media committee. So I have some do's and don'ts that I wanted to cover with you all. So on the do's list, I think I've probably beaten this horse dead, but yeah, your board members are committed to your organization because they're passionate about it, but they also probably have complete and full lives outside of the board work. So you want to be very respectful of their time and make sure that you're starting your meetings on time and you're ending your meetings on time. If you find that you can't do that, certainly you can start on time, I hope, but if you're finding that the meetings are running long, it may be that you need to break out some of the discussion that you're getting bogged down in to separate, like a committee or another group who's going to take that offline and is going to work through it and then bring it back to the board for decision. So if you are getting bogged down, it may mean you may need to restructure things a little bit. Keep that meeting on track. On the agenda, you may even want to lay out, okay, welcome and introductions is 5 minutes, and minute review and approval is 3 minutes, and financials is 20 minutes, and et cetera, et cetera. And so people have an expectation and understanding about how much time you're allocating for discussion. You lay that there so board members have a good understanding about that. Definitely stimulate debate. That is really the job of the leader of the organization, again, is to make sure that all board members are participating, that it's not just the one or two who always speak up and perhaps could be perceived to dominate the meeting. You want to be reading the body language of the room, and if you sense that there's a board member over here who may be moving anxiously in their chair or look like they're, they have a question but they're not speaking up, you want to invite that question, you want to invite that conversation and that dialogue. Really try to make sure that the conversation and the discussion and the dialogue moves around the room and everybody has an opportunity to speak up. Don't just let the couple of loud people dominate the discussion. Make sure you're following your bylaws regarding quorum and voting and any other requirements that you have in there. Your corporate secretary can help you with that, but again, you need to be familiar with that as well. Preparation, do that preparation ahead of time. It will make things a lot easier to be well prepared and organized, and the meeting will run much more smoothly. Follow, at least the basics of parliamentary procedure. I don't think people are all terribly familiar with Robert's rules anymore and following it to a T, but at least when it comes to things like approving, voting, and the like, you want to make sure that you are having the discussion and you're not calling for all the people in favor and any opposed, and that you've closed out the item and the result of the vote is being recorded for your minutes and your good board governance. And then make sure that in the meeting you are recognizing anyone who's coming in addition to the board members, of course, but any external experts who are coming in, if you have volunteers there, and certainly make sure that you acknowledge the good work of the staff, because as we all know, the staff is always woefully underpaid for the hard work that they're doing it. They're doing it out of their heart and their passion, so you want to make sure they get plenty of recognition for that. And then, as we talked a little bit about executive session, if you decide that you're going to need an executive session ahead of that board meeting, you want to bake in the amount of time, both for if it's executive session with the president and CEO of the organization, have time for that, and then you can move into, you just simply you excuse staff and everyone else from the meeting, except the CEO or the president of the organization stays in the room with the board, and then if also needed, then you can excuse that individual, and then you can have a private session with the board. If you are doing executive session, that means by definition that you are not probably going to have your staff person who's keeping track of the minutes in the room with you. You may if you decide that that's appropriate, but if not, you're going to need to designate somebody who in those executive sessions are going to be keeping track of what's discussed. If it is highly sensitive and confidential, you're not going to need a lot of detail for the record, but you will want to at least say, for the record, in executive session, we discussed this broad topic for this period of time, and these are the people who participated in that discussion. And then you can capture that in your minutes. So you'll need whether it's you or somebody else is going to need to make sure that you at least keep some record of what was discussed in executive session. On sort of the don't side of the equation, don't start late. Surprised that I would say that. Don't overschedule. You can be ambitious or overly ambitious, and you can have too many items in the agenda, and then that just gets frustrating because you end up running out of time, and then you end up having to take time away from breaks, or you run the risk of running over, or you don't get to things, which is even worse also. Just try to really gauge how much time and don't overschedule. If you have a lot that needs to be discussed, then maybe you do need to set a longer period of time for that board meeting and let the board know in advance. It may be hard to get people on a shorter notice for more time, so it may mean that you need to do follow-up work in committee to address whatever doesn't get addressed at the board meeting. Be a good gauge of how long the debate should be and how long it needs to run on. At some point, somebody may need to step in. You may need to step in and say, again, I think we've beaten this horse dead. We're going in circles. We aren't really making any forward progress. I think we've had enough discussion. We're going to cut off the discussion. You want the discussion to be robust and vigorous, but you also don't want it to go on to the point where your board members start losing attention. They start looking at their phones under the table or sneaking off out of the room. So, and I guess on that topic as well, make sure you bake in, depending, if your meeting's only an hour, you don't need to do this. But if you have a 3-hour board meeting, you need to bake in some breaks into the schedule. So board members know when they have time that they can step out of the room and they can go attend to business, and they aren't just sitting there on their devices typing away because they feel like they're trapped there for 3 hours. So you have to be sensitive to that and realistic to that. You shouldn't deviate from the agenda. Again, as a matter of good board governance, you discuss what you've agreed to discuss on in the agenda. If other topics come up, you table them for another meeting, but you shouldn't go off onto a tangent or into something that wasn't part of your original agenda. And then follow those time limits that you've set yourself as best as you possibly can. If it really is a critical issue, of course, there are going to be times when everybody agrees that that is the most important item to discuss, and other things are going to have to wait for the next meeting or for committee. But really try to stick to those limits. That is what I have right now. Do we have any questions?
Do committee members have to be board members as well?
No, that's a good question. Absolutely not, because you may need a committee for something where you don't necessarily have all the expertise on your board or maybe even on your staff. So you may need to augment your committee membership. That's a great time when you can recruit in someone who might be a great prospective board member, somebody that you've identified that has some skills or talent. They're not on the board currently, but they're interested in your organization. Maybe they've come to some of your events, or they've donated, or they're just supportive of your mission. So you might reach out to this person. Again, I keep using marketing as an example because I have no expertise in that, but you may know somebody that's their living. They're a great marketing person, and they're supportive of your organization, and you're standing up a marketing committee, but you're looking around your boardroom and you're realizing that you have a bunch of lawyers and finance people, right, and accountants, and you don't really have any marketing people. So you might recruit that person to be a member of the committee, and then that's, again, a really great way to sort of have board members in waiting. You can test them out and see if they are enjoying the work and they're really giving a lot to the organization, and they may come on board. So yes, you need to make sure that you're getting that expertise that you need. So if you have an audit committee and there isn't a single person on your audit committee who has any financial background, I think that's a risk. I think that's a concern. So there, I don't necessarily think you're going to want to get a volunteer, but you may need to look at beefing up your board membership so that you have the right person who can chair that audit committee. Because other members of the board are going to be really relying heavily on that audit committee chair to be able to work with the auditor and to be able to understand the conclusions of the auditor, so that everybody comes away with a high degree of confidence that the organization is financially healthy. But you're not limited to you're not limited to just board members and staff for your committees. You should feel free to recruit other talent as needed.
Okay. And if you were to create an ad hoc committee, do you have any guidelines in terms of stating how long that committee would remain in existence, or what the requirements are for kind of closing it out?
That's really good too, because an ad hoc committee wouldn't be established in the bylaws, right? So this is something that the board would be voting on to create, and then that would be captured in the minutes for the meeting. And I think that is a good suggestion, that you would say that, so let's say you're coming up at the 20th anniversary gala for your organization, and so you're going to put a gala committee together. The minutes would reflect that the board has decided to create this gala committee, and that it's for the purpose of supporting the 20th anniversary event, which is going to be held whenever it's going to be held, and so that committee will be constituted through that period of time, and these are the people who are on the committee, and this is sort of the charge of what they're going to be doing. And then you would capture all of that in the minutes, and then that committee would just terminate at the end of that engagement. But that would be the best place to capture, I think. And then if it's an ad hoc committee, it wouldn't go on forever and ever. If it's a committee that needs to go on forever and ever, then you need to go and amend your bylaws and have that thought through and worked on with your advisors.
And can you explain the concept of conflict of interest a little further, not specifically about New York, but just
sure.
general?
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's great. So when you have a new board member come on your board, and then periodically thereafter, I recommend annually, if there is a state law requirement, absolutely follow that. But let's say there isn't one, and I don't frankly know what Georgia follows, but at least initially when a board member comes on the board, and then periodically thereafter, I would say at least annually, each board member should complete some documentation, whether online or a piece of paper, where they are attesting that they do not personally have any conflict of interest that would prevent them from providing their complete and total fiduciary obligation to the board. So a board member has a fiduciary duty to the organization that it's serving. So they need to be disclosing if there's anything that they can think of. And you can suggest examples of, for example, as a board member, are you doing business with the organization? That's a classic potential conflict of interest. And with conflicts of interest, there are waivable conflicts of interest, and then there are non-waivable conflicts of interest. So if you're trying to be a board member, and this is a silly example, but it's an easy one to understand, if you're trying to be a board member and you have stolen money from the organization, that is a non-waivable conflict of interest, and that person would not be qualified to be on the board, and they would not be allowed to be a board member. But that example I said before, well, if you've been engaged in the organization perhaps because you are a vendor in some way to the organization, or have provided some services, or given some free time or consultative services to the organization in the past, you would disclose that as a potential conflict of interest, and then the organization, and this is where I would recommend you use your governance committee, if you have one, would take up that disclosure and determine this is a conflict that we believe is waivable because the work that this person was doing was either given it was time versus being paid by the organization, or even if the person was being paid by the organization, that was 5 years ago, or even the board decided that this person was the best person to, there was a competitive bid and this person won it, and so they were in the supply chain relationship in some way, and everybody knew that was happening and was agreed upon, and it was deemed to be fine, and it was a waivable conflict of interest. So there are a lot of different examples what could potentially be a conflict of interest, and that's where if you have a question, again, I would turn to your friends at the Pro Bono Partnership. They could probably help you walk through that analysis. But you definitely want to be making sure that your board members are all disclosing anything that could be a possible conflict, and then a determination is then made whether it is in fact a conflict or not, and if it is potentially one, whether it's waivable or not. And then, and that board member would of course have an ongoing obligation to disclose anything that came up in the time between they did their first disclosure and any subsequent disclosure. But you should have a conversation with new board members. And I guess I didn't really mention this concept of a new board member orientation, but it's a really good practice. It's a best practice that when you bring a new board member on, you have some sort of formal orientation with that board member, where you sit down with them, or at least on the telephone, go over the basic board documents, the bylaws, and conflict of interest disclosure form, any other rules or requirements that they need to know before they come to their first board meeting, so that they have a clear understanding of their responsibilities and their obligations and their duties to the organization. If you're a very large organization, you might even have a class of board members coming in at the same time, and you might have a board orientation class where it's a couple hours and you bring in the new board members and they sit down and they meet each other and you go over all of those sort of preliminaries.
Okay. And one last question. Do you have any suggestions on how to manage conflict between board members?
That's a good one. Human nature can get in the way. Yeah, I guess in any way you manage conflict in any of your relationships in the world, it is something that if you detect that there is conflict there, it is your responsibility to try to figure out how to eliminate that conflict. And whether it's directly by going to the individuals one-on-one and trying to figure out what it is that's causing the problem, or whether you get the two in a room together and try to work it out. I think the direct approach is best, and as the leader of the organization, I think it's better to take that responsibility on, as painful as it may be, because I'm sure you like your board members. But I think it's better to do it that way than have a staff member have to do it, or another board member have to do it. I think it's something that you have to confront head on, because if you're noticing it, others are noticing it, and then it's going to be distracting people from having a really good and productive board meeting, because they're going to be noticing that there's this